New Orleans Armstrong International Airport pulsed with steady, familiar chaos. A tapestry of flight announcements, suitcase wheels scraping across tile floors, and the low murmur of lives in transit. Among the crowd, moving neither fast nor slow, was a man whose presence demanded no attention, but somehow drew it anyway. Elijah Monroe, 62 years old, broad-shouldered from a lifetime of standing his ground, silver streaks threading through his close-cut hair, his eyes steady, the kind of eyes that had weathered storms and knew the cost of every mile walked. Today wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about making a statement. It was about peace. Pure, unbothered, well-earned peace. He wore a charcoal linen blazer that carried a memory of many summers, a pressed shirt beneath it, khaki trousers, and brown leather shoes polished not to dazzle, but to respect himself. In his right hand, he carried a battered, leather-bound copy of the Souls of Black Folk. Corners frayed, spines softened from being read and reread through the decades. In his left, his boarding pass. SkyWest Atlantic Flight 1749 to Boston. Seat 2A, first class. Not a gift, not a favor. Paid in full. As Elijah walked through gate 17A, there was an ease to his steps, a silent rhythm that didn't rush, didn't falter. A little girl holding her mother's hand glanced up at him and smiled shyly. Elijah dipped his head gently in return. Somewhere, a man barked into his cell phone about a business merger. A family scrambled to gather strollers and sippy cups. But Elijah moved through it all untouched, like a current of stillness cutting through noise. When he reached the gate agent, a young woman with tired eyes and a forced smile greeted him. "Good afternoon, sir. May I see your boarding pass?" Elijah handed it over without a word, just a warm, genuine smile. The woman's expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a softening around the edges. There was a flicker of recognition. Here is a man who carries himself like he belongs, without needing anyone's permission. "You're all set, Mr. Monroe. Enjoy your flight," she said, returning his pass. "Thank you," Elijah replied, his voice low and easy, as if the words themselves carried no urgency. As he boarded the jet bridge, he caught a glimpse of the plane's polished fuselage. SkyWest Atlantic's bold navy and silver logo gleaming against the Louisiana sun. A good omen, maybe? The flight attendant at the cabin door was a woman in her early 30s, her uniform crisp, but her posture already showing the fatigue of a long day. Still, when she saw Elijah, she straightened a little. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome aboard," she said, her smile faltering into something real. Elijah smiled back, not wide, but enough. "How you doing?" he asked, not out of obligation, but because he meant it, because the world too often forgot to ask. The attendant scanned his boarding pass and gestured him toward the front. "Right this way. You're in 2A, first class." Not because he needed legroom, not because he craved status, but because he had earned this. After 4 decades of shaping young minds, breaking barriers he wasn't supposed to cross, and carrying the invisible weight of being expected to be twice as good for half the credit, Elijah eased into his seat, feeling the firm, respectful cushion beneath him. He didn't throw his blazer overhead. Instead, he folded it neatly across his lap, as if it, too, deserved dignity. He adjusted the small nozzle above him, angling a soft flow of cool air onto his face. The cabin still smelled faintly of cleaning spray and stale coffee, familiar, oddly comforting. Opening his book to a worn page marked by a small tear at the corner, he settled in. The words rose to meet him like an old friend. "I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He wasn't here to be noticed. He wasn't here to defend his right to be comfortable. He was here because he wanted, because he deserved, to sit quietly among the clouds, to lose himself between the sky and the verses that had carried him through harder days. Passengers began trickling in behind him, business travelers juggling laptops, retirees whispering excitedly about their grandchildren, couples coordinating bag storage like a tactical operation. The usual. Every so often, Elijah caught a glance in his direction. Not aggressive, just curious. An older black man in first class wasn't what some people expected to see. Not yet, anyway. But Elijah had long since stopped explaining himself to the world. As he turned another page, savoring the texture of the paper beneath his fingertips, he felt, rather than saw, the cabin atmosphere shift. Something subtle, something unseen, like a tremor before a quake. The source of the disturbance was still approaching. Heavy, confident footsteps moving down the aisle. He didn't look up yet. He kept reading. Outside the window, the sky was a rich, endless blue, stretching out towards something unseen, something waiting. Elijah smiled to himself, small and private. He had no idea how much would change before this flight touched the ground. But he knew, deep down, that whatever came, he was ready. He had been ready for a long time. The familiar murmur of settling passengers filled the first-class cabin. Seatbelts clicked into place. Overhead bins thudded shut. Flight attendants moved with brisk efficiency, checking boarding passes, adjusting luggage, offering quiet smiles that rarely reached their eyes. Elijah Monroe remained still in seat 2A, book open, half forgotten in his lap. Outside the window, a fuel truck rumbled past, sunlight bouncing off its bright silver tank. Inside, the cabin felt suspended, that odd, transient quiet that falls just before a flight fully takes shape. The air, heavy with the scent of recycled oxygen and distant cologne, seemed to hum with expectation. It was in that moment of stillness that the disturbance arrived. A presence, sharp and jarring, cut through the calm like a blade. Captain Chase Kincaid, swaggering down the aisle with a kind of energy that didn't walk so much as announce itself. He was the embodiment of polished arrogance. Tall and athletic, tan from golf weekends in Scottsdale. Aviator sunglasses still perched unnecessarily on his face inside the dimly lit cabin. His uniform immaculate, but his posture loose, casual, too casual, like the plane was just an accessory to his ego. The arrogant pilot moved as if the entire aircraft existed to serve him. And maybe in his mind, it did. Flight attendants straightened when he passed, instinctively bracing themselves. The co-pilot, a younger man trailing behind him, laughed too quickly at a joke Kincaid muttered under his breath. The sycophantic chuckle of someone who had learned the cost of not laughing. Passengers offered polite nods or small deferential smiles. Kincaid barely registered them. He was used to being the king of his castle. At 30,000 feet, he believed himself untouchable. As he strode through first class, he clapped an older white businessman on the shoulder like an old buddy, exchanged a knowing grin with a flight engineer, and then he saw Elijah Monroe. He stopped walking. It wasn't a dramatic halt, not enough for most people to notice, but the slight stiffening of his shoulders, the quick flicker across his mouth, betrayed him. Elijah felt it. He didn't look up, not yet, but he felt the shift, the scrutiny, the unspoken question forming behind the pilot's mirrored lenses. Captain Kincaid tilted his head slightly, as if recalibrating what he was seeing. An older black man, alone, in seat 2A, first class, no briefcase, no expensive designer watch flashing from his wrist, no hurried cell phone calls about stock options or legal mergers. Just a book, an old blazer, and a quiet, unbothered presence. It didn't fit the story Kincaid was used to, and when something didn't fit, it needed to be challenged. Without removing his sunglasses, Kincaid stepped closer to Elijah's row, his voice rising slightly, loud enough to carry, loud enough to make sure there were witnesses. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right seat?" The words hung heavy in the air, coated with a casual cruelty sharper than any outright insult. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation dressed as courtesy. The nearby passengers, a woman with a designer tote bag, a man thumbing through emails on his phone, froze subtly, heads tilting just a fraction, the way people do when they sense a collision coming but aren't sure whether to intervene or pretend not to see. Elijah turned the page of his book slowly, finishing the line he had been reading. Only then did he lift his gaze. Their eyes met, the cool, mirror-shielded arrogance of Kincaid's gaze against Elijah's steady, unshakable calm. Elijah said nothing at first. He simply raised his boarding pass, holding it neatly between two fingers. No defensiveness, no apology, no need. Kincaid snatched it from Elijah's hand with just a little too much force, as if the paper itself would confirm or deny his suspicions. He glanced at it, Flight 1749. Seat 2A. Confirmed. But Kincaid's ego couldn't accept what the facts told him. He forced a smile, thin, strained, an ugly thing stretched across his face, and handed the boarding pass back. Then, muttering just low enough to feign innocence but just loud enough to ensure Elijah and several nearby passengers would hear, he said, "Well, I suppose there'll anyone up here now." The words landed with a soft thud of something dropped in a room full of breakables. No one moved. A beat of silence passed. The woman across the aisle clutched her tote bag tighter to her side. The man with the email stopped scrolling. Marcus Ellison, seated one row behind, felt his stomach tighten. Without thinking, instinctively, he slid his phone onto his lap and hit record. His thumb hovered just over the screen, catching every word, every sneer, every ounce of disrespect that stained the cabin air. Because moments like these, if left undocumented, had a way of evaporating, of being rewritten, minimized, denied. Elijah never broke eye contact. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He simply closed his book with a deliberate, respectful finality and said, in a voice so calm it was almost terrifying, "I believe I've earned this seat just like everyone else." The words weren't loud, but they were seismic. Kincaid smirked, a quick, dismissive curl of his lip, and turned away, heading toward the cockpit without another word. But the cabin felt different now. The oxygen had shifted. The energy had changed. And while the engines outside began to hum, preparing for ascent, inside the aircraft, something far more potent had been set into motion. Marcus kept recording for a few extra seconds. Then he stopped. He glanced around. He wasn't sure what he would do with the footage yet, but he knew one thing with certainty. Some things are too important to leave to memory alone. And far from the oblivious pilot up front, Elijah Monroe turned his gaze back out the window, not angry, not defeated, just still and waiting. Because he understood something Chase, Kincaid never would. Real power doesn't need an announcement. It simply sits where it belongs and waits for the world to catch up. The engines outside the aircraft hummed louder now, a low mechanical growl, signaling the inevitable, that the flight would soon leave the Earth behind. Inside the cabin, however, the air had shifted into something else entirely. A tension thick enough to feel, light enough that no one dared to break it. Marcus Ellison sat frozen in a seat 2 rows back, his thumb hovering just above the save button on his phone. He had captured it all. The arrogant pilot, the humiliating comment, the deafening silence that followed. Elijah Monroe sat back in 2A, shoulders square, gaze unfazed, the closed book resting lightly on his lap. He wasn't reading anymore, but he wasn't stewing either. He was waiting in the way trees wait through storms, not resisting, not bending unnecessarily, simply existing with a quiet, ancient resilience. Captain Chase Kincaid had already disappeared into the cockpit, no doubt feeling victorious in a battle only he had been foolish enough to start. He had no idea he had just cracked open something much bigger than a momentary insult. To him, it was a casual assertion of power, a habitual reminder of who belonged where. But to everyone who had heard the words, to everyone who had seen the shift in the air, it was a rupture, small, sharp, and irreparable. Across the aisle, a woman in a pale blue sweater whispered something to her husband. He, in turn, pulled out his phone and began scrolling, not checking emails this time, but looking at social media apps, as if sensing that somewhere, somehow, this moment needed a witness beyond seat 2A. Flight attendants moved up and down the aisle with mechanical smiles, handing out pre-departure drinks, champagne, orange juice, water. One of them, a blonde woman whose name tag read Jessica, lingered half a second longer than necessary at Elijah's row. "Would you care for something to drink, sir?" she asked, voice pitched a little higher than usual. Elijah looked up, offered her a small, courteous nod. "Ginger ale, please," he said simply. No anger, no coldness, just a man ordering a drink as if the world hadn't just witnessed him being diminished for no reason other than the assumptions wrapped around his skin. Jessica blinked, nodded quickly, and disappeared toward the galley. Marcus finally hit save on the video, the file tucking itself into the memory of his phone, like a live grenade waiting for the pin to be pulled. He wasn't sure what he was going to do with it yet. Post it? Send it to someone? Keep it hidden just in case? All he knew was this. Silence hadn't saved anyone he admired. Not really. Silence might have kept him employed. It might have kept him respectable. But it hadn't changed anything. The arrogant pilot had humiliated a black man in first class because deep down he believed he could. Because no one had ever taught him. Not really. That actions like that had consequences. Not yet. The seatbelt lights dinged above them, and the flight attendants moved into their practice choreography of safety demonstrations. Life jackets, oxygen masks, emergency exits. Elijah watched it all with mild interest, as if it were a play he had seen before and knew how it ended. As Jessica passed by again, she placed a small plastic cup of ginger ale on Elijah's tray table. He thanked her with a slight nod. She paused, opened her mouth, closed it again, and kept walking. Because what could she say? Sorry he treated you like you don't belong? Sorry the world still hasn't figured out how to see dignity before assumptions? Sorry isn't strong enough. Nothing was strong enough. The engines roared louder now, and the plane began to tremble slightly as it taxied toward the runway. Elijah took a sip of his ginger ale, feeling the fizz sting pleasantly against the back of his throat. He looked out the window. The tarmac blurred past. The nose lifted. Gravity surrendered. They were airborne, and so was something else. 30,000 feet above the Gulf of Mexico, while most passengers turned to movies and crossword puzzles and idle chatter, something was unfolding quietly in the background. Marcus had opened his Twitter app. His finger hovered above the upload button. He had trimmed the video down. No edits, no fancy captions, just raw truth. He added a simple line. Arrogant pilot humiliates black man in first class. Flight 1749. Sky West Atlantic. No hashtags. No angry commentary. No emojis. Just facts. Then he pressed post. For a second, nothing happened. Then the retweet started. 5, 12, 27. A river beginning at the mouth of a spring. He watched it grow, heartbeat kicking up speed to match the numbers on his screen. Something inside him twisted. Guilt, fear, responsibility, but also something else. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, when enough people saw it, they wouldn't be able to look away this time. Maybe the next Elijah Monroe wouldn't have to sit in silence while someone questioned his right to exist in a space he had earned 10 times over. Maybe silence wasn't the only way to survive anymore. Maybe it was time to speak. Meanwhile, Elijah sat still in seat 2A, unaware of the storm gathering in the digital cloud around him, unaware that the humiliating moment he had endured with grace was already lighting a fire he hadn't asked for but would not shrink from either. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the engines rumble and the book's weight in his lap anchor him. He wasn't angry, not because he hadn't been wronged, but because anger would have given Captain Kincaid too much. No, Elijah had long since learned that dignity is a louder rebuttal than rage. And sometimes the quietest acts become the ones that roar across the world. The arrogant pilot had tried to humiliate a black man in first class. But what he had done, without knowing it, was give the world a front row seat to a lesson it desperately needed. And this time, they were paying attention. The plane cut smoothly through the afternoon sky, gliding above wisps of clouds like a silent arrow. Inside the first-class cabin, the world shrank into a tense, uneasy quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't soothe. The kind that thickened the air, turned it into something you had to push through with every breath. Elijah Monroe sat in seat 2A, one leg crossed neatly over the other, his hand resting lightly atop the souls of black folk on his lap. He wasn't reading. Not anymore. His eyes stayed on the window, where the horizon stretched infinitely, a canvas of soft blues and thin silver lines where the world ended and began again. Across the aisle, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some tried to bury themselves in in-flight magazines or half-hearted conversations. Others stared blankly ahead, pretending not to feel the weight pressing down on the cabin. But they felt it. Everyone did. The humiliation had been quiet, casual, dismissible, to those who wanted to move on quickly. But the silence afterward, that was deafening. It spoke louder than any argument could have. A reminder, not all violence leaves bruises. Some of it leaves echoes. Flight attendants move mechanically down the aisle with drink carts, their smiles tighter than before. Jessica, the attendant who had served Elijah earlier, made a small detour to adjust an overhead bin that didn't really need adjusting. It was an excuse to glance, to witness. Her eyes flickered toward Elijah for half a second longer than necessary. There was a question there, unspoken. "Are you okay?" But she didn't ask. And Elijah didn't invite her to, because he didn't need sympathy. He needed space. Space to let dignity breathe. Marcus Ellison sat rigid in his seat behind Elijah, staring at the post he had made 20 minutes earlier. He refreshed the page again. Another 100 retweets. Another 100 hearts. Comments piling in, faster now. Unbelievable. Typical. Glad someone recorded it. This is why we say systemic. Marcus's chest tightened. He hadn't intended to become part of anything larger when he hit post. But now he realized he had cracked something open that couldn't be closed again. And it wasn't just about Elijah Monroe. It was about every assumption unchallenged. Every small humiliation swallowed to keep the peace. Every door passed through with shoulders squared, waiting for the next invisible tripwire. Marcus lowered his phone slowly onto his lap. His hands trembled slightly, but not from fear, from knowing that sometimes it wasn't the loud fights that sparked change. It was the silence that came after someone tried to strip your worth away, and you refused to let them. In the cockpit, Captain Chase Kincaid was blissfully unaware. He was focused on familiar routines, heading altitude, fuel gauges. He barked a few lazy instructions to his co-pilot, who responded with clipped professionalism, but with a nervous undercurrent that hadn't been there before. Because even up front, tucked behind doors and dials, the tension seeped through. Something had happened, and it wasn't going away. Not this time. Back in first class, Elijah finally stirred. He uncrossed his legs, sat up straighter, and opened his book again. Not at the page he'd been reading, but at a dog-eared passage he knew by heart. He read silently. "I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me." Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man. He closed the book again with a soft, final thud. He didn't need to read it aloud. The truth of it was already vibrating through the cabin. The woman in 3B, who hadn't said a word until now, leaned over to her husband and whispered, "He handled that better than I ever could have." Her husband nodded grimly, because everyone saw it. Everyone heard it. Even those who would later pretend they hadn't. Even those who would later say, maybe it was a misunderstanding, or, "I'm sure the pilot didn't mean it that way." They had heard it, and they had heard the silence that followed. Louder, sharper, more cutting than any shouting match could have been. Because Elijah hadn't risen to the bait. He hadn't raged or stormed down the aisle demanding justice. He had stayed. He had stayed seated, stayed dignified, stayed present. And in doing so, he had turned the shame back on the man who had tried to place it at his feet. 30 minutes into flight, a flight attendant named Brian, young and awkward in his uniform, stopped at Elijah's seat with a basket of snacks. He hesitated, then said, almost inaudibly, "Respect, sir. For real." It wasn't much, just 3 words, but they cracked the silence. Elijah lifted his gaze, meeting the young man's eyes, and nodded once, an acknowledgement without frills, without theatrics. Respect returned quietly and fully. Brian's cheeks flushed. He pushed the basket toward Elijah, offering him his choice. Elijah selected a small packet of almonds and placed them neatly on his tray. Another small, quiet victory. Another ripple in the silence. Far behind them, deep in the coach section, a teenage girl watching TikTok videos gasped as her feed refreshed. There it was. The video, the confrontation. The clip Marcus had posted. It was spreading faster now, gaining momentum like a spark caught in dry grass. Her gasp drew the attention of the passenger next to her, who looked over her shoulder. Then another, and another. The wave had begun. Still, Elijah remained in his seat, stillness wrapped around him like armor. Not hiding, not shrinking, just being. Because he knew something that could never be taught in classrooms or captured in company manuals. Dignity doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs to survive. And in that survival, it can echo louder than any voice raised in anger. Outside the cabin, the sun dipped lower toward the horizon, casting a burnished orange glow over clouds. Inside, Seat 2, it remained a monument, a quiet defiance, a living reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is stay exactly where you are and wait for the world to feel the weight of its own silence. At 32,000 feet, somewhere above the endless sprawl of Alabama's pine forests, a revolution sparked from the palm of one man's hand. Marcus Ellison sat stiffly in Seat 3C, the phone resting heavy in his lap. He kept glancing at it, refreshing, hesitating, doubting. The video was short, just 22 seconds. A tiny window into a much bigger world. The footage wasn't shaky or chaotic. It wasn't filled with yelling or dramatics. It was something far more powerful. Casual cruelty, unapologetic dismissal, quiet dignity refusing to bend. Marcus had filmed it instinctively, but uploading it, that had been a choice he had made. And now, the ripple had begun. At first, it was a trickle, a few retweets, a handful of likes, a comment here and there. This makes me sick. Happens every day. Glad someone caught it. Black man in first class deserves better. Marcus watched the numbers tick up faster, his pulse matching the rhythm. 50 views, 100, 200. The plane cruised smoothly through the sky, but Marcus felt like he was sitting on a powder keg. His wife, Selena, seated next to him, leaned in and whispered, "How bad is it?" He turned the screen so she could see. Her face tightened instantly. "Damn," she breathed. He knew what she was thinking. The same thing This wasn't just a bad look. This was proof. Proof of how even when a black man sat exactly where he was supposed to be, with a seat paid for fair and square, someone would still try to strip away his dignity. And this time, someone had caught it in 22 seconds flat. 3 rows ahead, Elijah Monroe remained an island of calm. He had no idea the digital firestorm igniting behind him. No idea that his simple act, sitting still, existing unapologetically, was now being dissected, retweeted, shared across timelines like a beacon. He simply sipped his ginger ale, thumb lightly stroking the spine of his book, as if grounding himself against whatever turbulence might come, both literal and otherwise. If he had known, he wouldn't have changed a thing. Because Elijah understood something that Captain Chase Kincaid never would. Dignity doesn't need an audience to be real. It only needs truth. Meanwhile, far below them on the ground, the video jumped platforms. From Twitter to TikTok, from TikTok to Facebook, from Facebook to Reddit. Each new post added a layer. Outrage, disbelief, sadness, solidarity. Comments flooded in. Typical example of casual racism. That black man handled it better than most could. This is why representation matters. Hashtags began clustering like storm clouds. Hashtag black man in first class. Hashtag humiliates black man. Hashtag arrogant pilot. Hashtag flight 1749 incident. The internet had seen enough stories like this before, but there was something about the quiet brutality of this one. Something about the fact that the black man hadn't yelled, hadn't fought, hadn't played into stereotypes. He had simply existed, and that had been enough to provoke humiliation. People felt it, deep in their bones, and they weren't about to let it pass unnoticed. In the back of the plane, a teenager named Zoe scrolled through her TikTok feed. The video popped up on her screen. She watched it once. Then again, her stomach twisted into a knot. It wasn't the words alone, though they stung. It was the smirk behind the words. The ease with which the arrogant pilot dismissed Elijah's humanity. Without thinking, Zoe shared the clip with the caption, "Imagine paying first-class prices and still getting treated like you don't belong. Disgusting." By the time the plane crossed into Tennessee airspace, Zoe's post alone had over 10,000 likes. By the time it reached Kentucky, the video had been stitched, remixed, and reposted hundreds of times by accounts with millions of followers. In the cockpit, Captain Kincaid still had no clue. He chuckled at a private joke with his co-pilot, flexed his hands on the yoke, and admired himself in the reflection of the cockpit glass. He thought the turbulence he might encounter would be atmospheric. He was wrong. The turbulence was waiting for him on the ground, and it had already been named. #arrogant pilot. Selena touched Marcus's arm again. "It's really blowing up," she whispered. Marcus nodded tightly. "Good," he said. But the word didn't taste like triumph. It tasted like sorrow. Sorrow that this was even necessary. Sorrow that quiet dignity had to be defended with hashtags and viral outrage. Still, he knew change never came from comfort. And sometimes the most uncomfortable moments were the ones that move mountains. A few rows ahead, a white businessman put down his Wall Street Journal and opened Twitter. His brow furrowed as he recognized the interior of the plane he was sitting on. The same navy leather seats, the same pale gray carpeting, the same layout. He glanced at Elijah, then quickly looked away. Shame, guilt, recognition. It flickered across his face like a short circuit. He wasn't the one who had said the words, but he had heard them, and he had said nothing. And now the whole world was watching. The plane began its slow descent toward Boston Logan International Airport. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, will be landing shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Elijah complied without comment. Around him, the cabin buzzed not with conversation, but with a strange, brittle energy. Phones were out. Fingers were tapping screens frantically. Word was spreading faster than the plane could fly. 22 seconds. That's all it had taken. 22 seconds to expose something that had festered silently for decades. 22 seconds to peel back the polite veneer and show the rot beneath. 22 seconds to prove, once again, that presence alone could be a revolutionary act. And Elijah Monroe, whether he knew it or not, had just reminded the world of that simple, devastating truth. The wheels of Flight 1749 squealed against the tarmac at Boston Logan International, jarring everyone slightly in their seats. Outside, the sky was overcast, thick with clouds that pressed low and heavy, as if mirroring the tension inside the aircraft. Passengers unbuckled belts, reached for bags, shifted impatiently. The normal chaos of landing. But this landing wasn't normal. Not anymore. Something invisible rode with them. A buzz, an electricity that had nothing to do with turbulence. It was a knowledge that the world beyond this cabin already knew what happened inside it, and it was spreading fast. Marcus Ellison tucked his phone back into his jacket pocket, heart still pounding. He had checked the video one last time during descent. Hundreds of thousands of views, thousands of comments. It was no longer just a video. It was a movement gathering momentum. And at the center of it, without even knowing, sat Elijah Monroe, quietly gathering his things, still as composed as when he boarded hours ago in New Orleans. Across the aisle, Selena whispered, "It's everywhere, Marcus. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, even Facebook moms are posting it." Marcus just nodded grimly. The world hadn't even officially heard Elijah's name yet, but they knew the story. Arrogant pilot humiliates black man in first class. 22 seconds had been enough. As the passengers disembarked, the atmosphere felt strange, heavy, reverent. Flight attendants who had spent years perfecting the art of plastic politeness now glanced sideways at Elijah, their faces tight with something unspoken. Guilt? Admiration? Fear? Maybe all of it. Jessica, the blonde flight attendant who had served Elijah ginger ale earlier, found herself rooted awkwardly by the galley as he approached. She opened her mouth to say something, an apology, maybe, or just acknowledgement, but the word stuck. Instead, she gave him a small, shaky nod. Elijah returned it with a calm, steady look. Not forgiveness, not accusation, just acknowledgement. And somehow, that made it hit harder. Outside the gate, the terminal buzzed with the usual late afternoon rush. Businessmen dragging roller bags, families herding excited children, college students hunched over laptops. But sprinkled among them were glances, subtle, searching glances. Phones lit up in hands. Screens refreshed and refreshed again. Already, news outlets were picking up the story. A headline flashed across an airport news screen. Passenger records first-class humiliation. Airline responds. No names yet, no confirmations. But it didn't matter. The narrative had already taken flight, and it had no intention of landing gently. Elijah walked to the terminal with the same quiet dignity he had boarded with. No slouching, no shrinking. Just a man moving to the world like he had every right to be there, because he did. As he passed by a group of 20-somethings huddled around a phone, one of them, a young woman with purple hair and a nose ring, looked up and froze. Recognition flickered across her face. She opened her mouth, then closed it, all visible in her wide eyes. She didn't call out. She didn't rush him for a selfie or a quote. She simply watched him pass, phone still glowing with the paused image of Elijah, sitting in seat 2A, holding his boarding pass out with quiet dignity, while the arrogant pilot loomed over him. Back online, the storm had become a hurricane. Influencers reposted the video with captions like, "This is why we need to record everything. Dignity under fire." Arrogant pilot tried to humiliate a black man, but only exposed himself. Celebrities started chiming in. A famous actor tweeted, "This is what black excellence looks like. Calm, unshaken, powerful. Hashtag black man in first class." A best-selling author posted on Instagram, "The look in his eyes says everything. We see you, sir, and we stand with you." By the time Elijah reached baggage claim, his name was trending nationally. Not that he knew. He still hadn't looked at his phone. At Gate 14, where a new group of passengers waited aboard the next SkyWest Atlantic flight, a murmur passed through the crowd as someone showed the video on their iPad. Some gasped, some shook their heads in disgust. Others, those who had always known but rarely seen it so plainly captured, simply nodded grimly, because this wasn't new. It was just newly visible. Meanwhile, SkyWest Atlantic's corporate offices, located in a glassy tower in downtown Atlanta, were already in full panic mode. The PR director, a woman named Charlotte Myers, had her head in her hands as screenshots and angry tweets flooded the giant monitor in the crisis response room. "We need a statement. Now!" she barked at her team. But no one knew what to say, because damage control was useless when the truth was playing on every screen in America. And there was no spinning what that video showed. An arrogant pilot, a black man in first class, and a nation unwilling to look the other way anymore. In a modest hotel room just a few miles from the airport, Marcus sat at the edge of the bed, watching the video replay again and again. Selena sat beside him, scrolling through news articles piling up by the minute. "We need to tell him," she said softly. Marcus nodded. They had debated it on the ride over from the airport, whether to call Elijah, whether to tell him how big it had gotten, whether to warn him that the world now knew about the moment he had handled with such quiet strength. Marcus pulled out his phone. His hand shook, not from fear, but from the immensity of what started from 22 seconds of truth. He stared at the screen, at the clip pause on Elijah's face, composed, dignified, enduring, and he whispered under his breath, "They're not going to ignore this. Not this time, because a black man in first class had been humiliated, because an arrogant pilot had tried to make him small, because someone had dared to hit record. And now, the world had to choose. Look away, or finally, pay attention." 30,000 feet above ground, hurtling through a sea of white clouds, the cabin of Flight 1749 felt different now. Not louder, not chaotic, but heavier, as if every molecule of recycled cabin air had thickened, infused with an invisible charge. The video was out there. The world was watching. And somehow, everyone on board could feel it. Even those who hadn't seen a single frame. It started small. A teenager near the back, earbuds in, shifting uncomfortably as she refreshed her feed and caught sight of the trending headline. Arrogant pilot humiliates black man in first class. Passenger captures shocking moment. She looked up, as if expecting to see the headline written across the cabin walls. In a way, she did, because the tension now vibrated through every seatbelt buckle. Every clipped announcement, every forced smile from the crew. Elijah Monroe, still seated calmly in 2A, sensed a shift long before anyone said a word. He felt in the way the flight attendant's hands shook slightly when offering water, in the way passengers stole glances his way, not hostile now, but cautious, curious, ashamed. Some looked at him and quickly looked away. Others held their gaze a second too long, as if trying to apologize with their eyes for what they had allowed to happen. Elijah said nothing. He didn't need to, because in that silence, he was speaking louder than any shouted accusation. 3 rows behind him, Marcus Ellison gripped his phone tightly. The numbers were staggering now. 500,000 views, tens of thousands of shares. Celebrities were retweeting. Activists were tagging the airline, demanding accountability. Local news stations were reaching out for interviews. Flight 1749 wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a flashpoint. And Marcus knew it wasn't just about this flight. It was about every microaggression suffered in silence. Every, "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" whispered or barked or sneered at men like Elijah. Today, someone had caught it. And today, the world refused to look away. Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman put down his newspaper for good. He glanced at Elijah, then stared out the window, jaw tight. Maybe remembering the times he had seen something like this and stayed silent. Maybe realizing silence wasn't neutral anymore. It was a choice. And the weight of that choice pressed down harder than the gravity, trying to pull the plane back to Earth. At the front of the cabin, the flight attendants moved with mechanical precision, over-smiling, over-correcting, trying desperately to paper over the crack that had split their tidy world. Jessica, the blonde attendant, shot a glance toward the cockpit door. She knew, everyone knew, Captain Chase Kincaid, the arrogant pilot, was still up there behind reinforced doors, still operating under the illusion that authority would shield him. But authority didn't bend algorithms. It didn't erase digital footprints. And it sure as hell didn't erase the truth, captured in 22 undeniable seconds. Passengers were whispering now, not loudly, but urgently. Snippets floated through the air like static. It's on Twitter, already over 1 million views. It's bad, real bad. He didn't even do anything wrong. Elijah caught none of it directly. He didn't need to. He could feel the vibration in the walls of the plane itself. He closed his eyes briefly, resting his hand on his chest, grounding himself. He had survived worse storms than this. He had stood through hurricanes of dismissal, suspicion, outright hate, and survived intact. This wasn't new, but maybe, just maybe, the world's reaction this time would be. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, jarringly cheerful. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our initial descent into Boston shortly. We hope you've had a comfortable flight with us today. The words, meant to reassure, now rang hollow. Marcus snorted under his breath. Comfortable? Maybe for those whose existence was never questioned. For Elijah Monroe, comfort had always been something fought for, protected fiercely, even in places he had paid full price to occupy. The cabin tilted gently as the plane began its descent. Outside the windows, Boston sprawl unfurled, neighborhoods, highways, clusters of downtown towers pushing up toward the gray afternoon sky. Inside, tension pushed downward, pressing into shoulders and lungs and throats. Jessica passed by Elijah's row again, pausing longer than necessary. She hesitated. Then, in a voice low enough that only he could hear, whispered, "I'm sorry." She didn't elaborate, didn't pretend she hadn't seen it. And in that moment, Elijah did something few noticed. He smiled, not a wide grin, not a victorious smirk. A small, tired, infinitely kind smile. Because even amidst humiliation, even amidst injustice, Elijah understood something that few ever learned. Acknowledgement is powerful, and change, however slow, always starts with someone noticing the wrong. He nodded once, graciously. Jessica's eyes glistened slightly before she moved on, head bowed. At the back of the plane, Zoe, the teenager with the earbuds, furiously texted her friends. "Dude, I'm literally on that plane. The vibe is insane. Everyone knows." Screens lit up down the rows as more passengers searched hashtags, read threads, realized they were inside a moment bigger than themselves. Some started recording discreetly, not knowing exactly what they were waiting for, just sensing they might need proof of what was coming next. Because Flight 1749 was no longer just a flight. It was a living, breathing reckoning. And no one could unsee it now. The plane descended lower, the skyline growing sharper. Seatbelt signs blinked overhead. Final announcements were made. But the true announcement had already been delivered by a black man in first class who had refused to shrink when challenged. And in the quiet, in the simple act of remaining seated, Elijah Monroe had shifted something in every soul aboard that plane. As wheels touched down on Boston's rain-slicked runway, a ripple of breath passed through the cabin. Not relief, awareness. Something had awakened at 30,000 feet, and there was no putting it back to sleep. Flight 1749 taxied slowly toward its gate, but the real turbulence was already raging thousands of feet below. On the ground, the internet wasn't just buzzing anymore. It was roaring. In the span of the final descent, the video of Elijah Monroe, calm, composed, simply existing in seat 2A while the arrogant pilot tried to humiliate him, had exploded across every platform imaginable. And now, the ground was fighting back. Sky West Atlantic's customer service inbox was the first to drown. Emails flooded in at a rate no automated system could handle. Is this how you treat paying customers? Demanding answers. Now. Your pilot's behavior is disgusting. Unsubscribing from your airline for good. The official at Sky West Atlantic Twitter account posted a bland, pre-written response. We are aware of an incident aboard Flight 1749 and are conducting an internal review, but it backfired immediately. Underneath the tweet, furious responses piled up. Internal review equals sweeping it under the rug? Call what it is, racism. A black man was humiliated in first class, and you're worried about PR optics? The ratio was brutal. Thousands of quote tweets, every one a hammer blow. News organizations pounced next. Within minutes, local Boston stations were airing breaking news alerts. Viral video. Sky West Atlantic pilot under fire after incident involving black passenger in first class. CNN picked it up. So did NBC. Then Good Morning America teased it for the next day's broadcast. And every headline, every single one, carried the same burning phrases. Arrogant pilot. Black man in first class. Public outrage. In the boardroom of Sky West Atlantic's headquarters in Atlanta, panic was spreading even faster than the video. The CEO, a stiff man in a tailored navy suit named William Graves, stood at the head of a long mahogany table glaring at his team. How the hell did this happen? He demanded. No one answered. The VP of operations shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The head of PR, Charlotte Myers, was already on her third cup of bad coffee, her hands trembling slightly. We have protocols for this. Graves growled. Charlotte shook her head. Protocols don't work when half the country's seen the footage before we've even landed the flight. Graves pounded his fist lightly on the table. I want this contained. Charlotte's voice cracked slightly as she replied. It's already bigger than containment. Meanwhile, back at Logan Airport, Elijah walked through the arrival terminal, blending into the crowd like any other traveler. But he wasn't any other traveler. Not anymore. Somewhere between takeoff and landing, Elijah Monroe had become a symbol, a mirror, a reckoning. People didn't recognize his name yet, but they recognized the weight he carried. Passengers who had been on the same flight gave him sidelong glances as they collected their luggage, their faces mixtures of guilt, admiration, and quiet discomfort. A few opened their mouths to speak. None did. They weren't ready. Maybe they never would be. Marcus Ellison and Selena trailed a few steps behind him, arguing in hushed tones. We should tell him, Selena insisted. He needs to know how big this is. Marcus hesitated, staring at Elijah's steady, unhurried steps. There was something almost sacred about the way he moved, a man who refused to be hurried by the chaos around him. I don't want to burden him, Marcus said quietly. He's carried enough already. Selena folded her arms. It's not a burden. It's his dignity being defended, finally. They exchanged a long look. Then Marcus nodded once. "You're right," he said, voice low, but it's still his choice how to carry it. At gate C-19, two ground crew members leaned over a smartphone, watching a viral clip. One of them, a young Latina woman, shook her head. Man didn't even raise his voice. And that pilot still treated him like he didn't belong. The other, a white man in his early 30s, just muttered, "About damn time someone caught it on tape." The anger wasn't confined to any one race, one group, one type of person. It was collective, because even those who hadn't lived it knew, deep down, that something about the system was wrong. And now, they had 22 seconds of undeniable proof. Inside Sky West Atlantic's Operations Center, phones kept ringing. Internal memos flashed across screens. Investigate Captain Kincaid. Review prior complaints. Prepare preliminary press statement number 2. In hushed voices, employees whispered. He's had warnings before. Yeah, but they always buried it. Not this time. Not after this. Whispers turned to murmurs. Murmurs into anger. Because the truth wasn't just about one man's arrogance. It was about a culture that had allowed it to grow unchecked. And now, under the blinding glare of public scrutiny, the roots of that rot were being exposed for all to see. Far away, in homes across America, people watched the clip again and again. Parents explained it to their teenagers. Teachers prepared to use it in Monday civics discussions. Activists folded it into campaigns for systemic change. It wasn't just about Elijah Monroe anymore. It was about every black man who had ever been questioned for sitting too close to the front of the plane. Every black student mistaken for a janitor. Every black professional asked, "Are you sure you belong here?" It was a wound laid bare. And this time, there would be no quietly stitching it back up and pretending it hadn't bled. As Elijah stepped out into the cool Boston air, a gust of wind lifted the hem of his blazer slightly. He adjusted the strap of his worn leather duffel and walked forward, steady and calm, unaware that millions of eyes were already following his path. A quiet man, a battered book, a stolen moment of dignity reclaimed. The messages from the ground had already started pouring in, and they would not be silenced. Not today. Not ever again. Captain Chase Kincaid strutted to the terminal at Boston Logan like nothing had happened. Still wearing his aviators indoors, still exuding that effortless arrogance that had carried him through 2 decades of unchecked power in the skies. He didn't check his phone. He didn't notice the glances, sharper now, almost cutting, from the gate agents, the flight attendants walking by, even some passengers lingering near the monitors broadcasting CNN in muted horror. He didn't notice the news crawlers running beneath the footage. Arrogant pilot humiliates black man in first class. Airline responds. But the world noticed him. And this time, the world wasn't about to let him stroll away clean. By the time Kincaid reached the Sky West Atlantic Crew Lounge, his name was already trending nationally. Hashtag arrogant pilot. Hashtag humiliates black man. Hashtag flight 1749 incident. Inside the lounge, a few flight attendants clustered around a television mounted in the corner. When Kincaid entered, the room fell into an awkward, brittle silence. He smirked, oblivious. "What's the drama?" he joked, tossing his flight bag onto a chair. Jessica, the blonde attendant from earlier, caught his eye for just a second. Her face was pale. Her hands trembled slightly where they gripped a styrofoam cup of coffee. She didn't answer him. She didn't have to, because the TV behind her answered for her. There, frozen mid-frame, was an image of Elijah Monroe, steady, calm, dignified, holding up his boarding pass while Kincaid loomed over him, smug and dismissive. Muted, the segment played again. "Well, I suppose they'll let anyone up here now." The words didn't need volume to hit like a slap. Kincaid's smirk faltered. Slightly, he pulled out his phone. Notifications flooded the screen faster than he could process them. Missed calls, texts, mentions, emails from supervisors marked urgent. He clicked on one of the texts from his base manager. "Get to the office immediately. Do not speak to anyone. Do not post anything." Another text followed seconds later. "This is serious, Chase." His stomach flipped for the first time. Serious? He had survived Sirius before. Angry passengers, anonymous complaints, a warning letter here, a disciplinary review there, all brushed aside by Favor's charm and connections. He wasn't worried. Not really. At least, not yet. Across the lounge, Jessica stepped closer to the TV. The volume remained muted, but the closed caption screamed, "Sky West Atlantic under fire as video of black man being humiliated by pilot goes viral." Another headline rolled across. Airline faces backlash for culture of disrespect. Kincaid swallowed hard. Culture, not isolated incident. Culture, and he was the poster boy. At that same moment, in Sky West Atlantic's Atlanta headquarters, a crisis meeting blazed into full panic mode. Conference lines buzzed. Emails blasted. Internal documents were being combed through at breakneck speed. Someone, a low-level analyst, had pulled Kincaid's personnel file. What they found wasn't shocking to those who had known him. A trail of complaints, whispers, anonymous surveys, passengers who had felt uncomfortable, but couldn't prove enough to press. It was all there, hidden, ignored, protected, until now, because now, there was a 22-second video, and the internet doesn't forgive, or forget. Inside the Boston crew office, Kincaid was ushered into a small, windowless room. The base manager, a weary woman named Denise Arnold, waited for him with a folder already open on the table. Her mouth was a grim, tight line. "Sit," she said. Kincaid sat, tried to keep the cocky grin plastered on his face. Tried to treat it like any other slap on the wrist review. Denise pushed a printout across the table. A still frame from the video. The caption read, "Arrogant pilot humiliates black man in first class." Kincaid forced a laugh. "This is ridiculous. I was just joking." The guy didn't even say anything. He wasn't upset. Denise stared at him. "Doesn't matter," she said flatly. "The world's upset." He opened his mouth, but she cut him off. "You're being placed on immediate administrative leave, pending investigation." The words hit him harder than any turbulence he had ever flown through. Leave? Pending investigation? No flight hours? No paycheck? "No one's even heard my side yet," he snapped, losing his composure for the first time. Denise leaned forward slightly. Her voice, when she spoke, was cold steel. "The video is your side, Chase." And for the first time in years, maybe for the first time in his entire career, Chase Kincaid understood. He wasn't flying above the consequences anymore. He was sinking straight into them. Meanwhile, across social media, the backlash swelled. Sky West Atlantic stock price dipped in after-hours trading. Civil rights attorneys posted open letters demanding justice. Advocacy groups announced boycotts unless meaningful corrective action was taken. And the headlines evolved. The price of arrogance at 30,000 feet. How a quiet man in 2A brought down a culture of entitlement. Back in Boston, Elijah Monroe sat at a modest diner near the airport, nursing a cup of black coffee. His duffel sat beside him. His book lay open but unread. The waitress, a middle-aged black woman with kind eyes, recognized him immediately, not from knowing him personally, but from knowing the look. She set down his coffee and simply said, "Thank you." No fanfare. No spectacle, just acknowledgement. Elijah nodded in return, grateful for the silence that spoke louder than any headline, because he hadn't boarded flight 1749 to make history. He had boarded to find peace. And somehow, by sitting still, by refusing to shrink, he had cracked open a storm too big to be ignored. And somewhere, far away, an arrogant pilot sat alone, finally facing it. The community center was nothing grand. No marble floors, no grand chandeliers. Just scuffed tile, folding chairs, and the faint, steady hum of the heating system kicking in to fight the brisk Boston afternoon. In the middle of the gym, under a single flickering fluorescent light, two chairs sat facing each other. One for Elijah Monroe, one for Sierra Maddox. No podium, no crowd, no makeup artist hovering. No handlers whispering notes. Just truth. Raw, heavy, and waiting to be spoken. Sierra Maddox, an investigative journalist known for chasing real stories, not clickbait, adjusted her mic and glanced at Elijah. She had interviewed senators, CEOs, whistleblowers, but something about this interview felt different, bigger, not louder, deeper, because sometimes the loudest shifts happen in silence. And Elijah Monroe, the black man in first class who had refused to shrink when humiliated, had become the voice the country didn't know it had been waiting for. Sierra offered a small smile as the cameraman counted down. 3, 2, 1. The red light blinked to life. Recording. Live. Mr. Monroe, Sierra began, voice gentle but sure. When you boarded Flight 1749, did you have any idea, any inkling that we'd be sitting here today? Elijah smiled faintly, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I imagine a cold drink, he said. Maybe a nap. That's about it. Sierra chuckled softly, but there was sadness behind it too. And when the pilot questioned your right to be there, she asked, leaning forward slightly, what went through your mind? Elijah was quiet for a long moment, the kind of pause that felt deliberate, measured, weighted with a lifetime of experience. Finally, he said, I've been asked if I belonged in a lot of rooms, Ms. Maddox. That one just happened to have wings. The words landed like a thunderclap. Even the cameraman, a grizzled veteran of war zones and protest marches, shifted slightly behind his lens. It was perfect, sharp, true, unflinching. Sierra's throat tightened, but she pressed on. You didn't react with anger, she said carefully. Why? Elijah folded his hands neatly in his lap. Because I wasn't surprised, he said simply. And because I wasn't there to make a scene. I was there to sit in the seat I paid for. Fair and square. No one's disbelief ever changed my truth. For a heartbeat, the room felt suspended, floating just above the floor. The clip of that quote would go viral within hours. It would be stitched onto banners, turned into memes, whispered across classrooms and boardrooms alike. But Elijah wasn't thinking about that. He wasn't performing. He was just telling the truth, the way he always had. Sierra's voice softened. Do you think anything will change after this? Elijah leaned back slightly in his chair. I don't know, he admitted, but I know this. You can't unsee dignity once you've seen it. You can't unhear silence once it echoes loud enough. He paused. And sometimes, he added, the hardest battles are won just by refusing to move. Across the country, as the interview streamed live, millions watched in rapt silence. At airports, in living rooms, on subway trains, everywhere, people paused to hear a man who wasn't shouting, wasn't demanding, just sitting, just being, unapologetic, unmoved, unbreakable. In Atlanta, inside SkyWest Atlantic headquarters, executives watched too, their faces pale, their hands fidgeting with pens and coffee cups, and hope slipping like sand through fingers. They had planned a second statement, more polished, more corporate. It was supposed to move past the incident. After Elijah's interview aired, they knew there was no moving past it. Not anymore. Meanwhile, at a small elementary school in Detroit, a teacher paused her lesson to play Elijah's interview for her students. When it ended, a fifth grader raised his hand. Why did they think he didn't belong? The boy asked. The teacher swallowed hard, blinked fast, and answered the only way she could. Because sometimes, she said, people carry small pictures of what belonging looks like, and it's our job to make those pictures bigger. The boy nodded slowly, understanding more than he could say. Back at the community center, Sierra leaned forward for her final question. Mr. Monroe, she asked, what would you say to people who felt like they didn't belong, who've been questioned, doubted, dismissed? Elijah didn't hesitate. He looked straight into the camera, straight into the hearts of everyone watching, and said, you can't control how they see you. You can only control how you see yourself. And when you sit tall, when you stay steady, you remind them your worth isn't up for debate. Sierra felt the sting of tears, but blinked them back. The cameraman gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The interview ended, but the impact was just beginning. Later that night, clips of Elijah's words flooded social media. This one just had wings. You can't unsee dignity once you've seen it. Your worth isn't up for debate. The hashtag shifted too. From outrage to reverence. From anger to admiration. Hashtag respect Elijah Monroe. Hashtag dignity unshaken. Hashtag the Monroe lesson. It wasn't just about an arrogant pilot anymore. It wasn't even about an airline. It was about power. Who had it, how it had been misused, and how a black man in first class had redefined it without raising his voice or lifting a fist, just by sitting still. Elijah Monroe returned to his hotel room that night exhausted. Not from the interview, not from the flight, but from the heavy weight of being seen. Really seen. He hung his blazer carefully on the back of the chair, set his book gently on the nightstand. Then he sat by the window, looking out at the city lights, and whispered a line from a poem he had memorized long ago. I, too, am America. And finally, he allowed himself a real smile, not because the battle was over, but because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't fighting it alone. The world didn't just move after Elijah Monroe's interview. It shifted. Tectonic, irreversible, undeniable. Within 12 hours of the broadcast, hashtags flooded every corner of the internet. Hashtag the Monroe lesson. Hashtag Monroe code. Hashtag black man in first class. People weren't just angry anymore. They were organizing, demanding, changing, and Sky West Atlantic. The airline that had, for years, buried complaints and tolerated microaggressions behind polished PR smiles, was now a company on the edge of collapse. Inside the corporate offices in Atlanta, the atmosphere was suffocating. Emergency meetings stacked on top of each other. Legal teams huddled in dark conference rooms. Public relations managers fielded nonstop calls from journalists, government officials, even celebrities demanding answers. And worst of all, investors were calling too, because the stock had dropped another 8% overnight. Graves, the CEO, paced the length of the boardroom like a caged animal. He slammed a thick folder onto the conference table. Inside, printed screenshots of thousands of complaints. Every tweet, every Facebook post, every Reddit thread dissecting the culture of discrimination they had spent years pretending didn't exist. This is a goddamn firestorm. Graves barked. No one disagreed, because everyone knew it wasn't just Chase Kincaid anymore. It was the entire system that had allowed him to thrive unchecked. Charlotte Myers, the head of PR, rose slowly from her chair. She took a breath. We have two options, she said. Option one, deny, downplay, claim this was an isolated incident. Graves' nostrils flared. Option two, he snapped. Charlotte met his gaze squarely. Own it. Apologize fully. Launch real reform. Create a code of conduct so strict, so public, that even your worst critics will have to acknowledge it. Graves stared at her. No half measures? Charlotte shook her head. Half measures got us here. There was a long, brutal silence. Finally, Graves sank into his chair. Fine, he muttered, but if we're going down, we're dragging Kincaid with us. Charlotte allowed herself the smallest nod, because she knew it wasn't about saving the airline's image anymore. It was about survival. Meanwhile, across the country, change was already in motion. Former employees began speaking out. Whistleblowers, flight attendants, co-pilots. Stories poured in. Pilots who joked about diversity hires behind closed cockpit doors. Passengers of color routinely moved or questioned without cause. Complaint reports buried so deep, they might as well have been written in invisible ink. It wasn't just about Elijah Monroe anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel like an outsider in spaces they had every right to occupy. And now, the dam had broken. Sky West Atlantic announced a new policy within 48 hours. They called it the Monroe Code. The press release was careful, respectful, almost reverent. The Monroe Code is a binding standard of conduct inspired by the dignity and resilience of Mr. Elijah Monroe, whose quiet strength reminded us all of what we must protect. The right of every person to be treated with honor, no matter where they sit, where they come from, or what they look like. Mandatory inclusivity training was ordered for every employee, from gate agents to executives. Every incident of passenger mistreatment would now be recorded, reviewed independently, and publicly reported. Every crew member was required to sign a personal accountability pledge modeled directly on Elijah's words. You cannot control how others see you. You can only control how you see yourself and how you see those you serve. No one missed the symbolism. No one missed the point. The Monroe Code wasn't just a new rule book. It was a reckoning, a blueprint for how the skies and the world had to change. Captain Chase Kincaid didn't survive the fallout. Within days, his contract was terminated quietly but firmly. An internal memo confirmed his departure. Captain Chase Kincaid is no longer employed by West Atlantic Airlines. We thank him for his years of service and wish him well in future endeavors. It was corporate language, sanitized, hollow, but everyone knew the truth. He wasn't thanked. He was expelled, a fossil of an era that had already begun to crumble. Meanwhile, Elijah Monroe stayed silent. No press tours, no book deals, no Twitter rants. He simply continued living, teaching quietly by example, receiving handwritten letters from students, strangers, civil rights leaders. Everyone thanked him. Not for yelling, not for fighting fire with fire, but for sitting still, for refusing to let their assumptions become his truth. One night, about a week after the announcement of the Monroe Code, Elijah sat on his back porch in Baton Rouge. The crickets chirped. The stars stretched endless across the southern sky. He rocked gently in the old wooden chair Gloria had picked out years ago, the one that creaked if you leaned too far left. Beside him, his granddaughter Ava curled up with a blanket, her head resting against his shoulder. "Grandpa," she whispered sleepily, "is it over?" Elijah looked out into the night. "No, baby," he said softly. "It's just beginning. Because real change isn't a moment. It's a movement. And sometimes it starts with nothing louder than a man sitting still and refusing to move for anyone's small picture of who he should be." In the weeks that followed, the storm slowly receded. The headlines faded from the front pages. The hashtags slowed their wildfire pace. Other scandals, other headlines, other tragedies rose up to claim the world's attention. But something stayed behind. Something rooted. A change that couldn't be unseen, unheard, or undone. Because a black man in first class had refused to shrink. Had refused to justify his presence. Had refused to hand his dignity over to anyone else's assumptions. And the world had noticed. West Atlantic rolled out the Monroe Code on every flight, every terminal, every training session. Other airlines, quietly at first, then more publicly, followed suit. Mandatory cultural sensitivity programs. Zero-tolerance policies for passenger mistreatment. Public transparency dashboards tracking incidents. It wasn't perfect. Progress never is. But the rules had changed. The bar had been raised. And it had been raised by a man who had done nothing more radical than sit still and stay whole. Elijah Monroe didn't capitalize on the moment. He didn't start a nonprofit. Didn't launch a speaking tour. Didn't become a talking head on TV. He simply kept living. The way he always had. On his own terms. One crisp morning in Baton Rouge, Elijah sat at his kitchen table, sunlight slanting across the hardwood floor. Ava, his granddaughter, sat across from him, swinging her legs impatiently as she finished her homework. She glanced up at him, brown eyes wide and curious. "Grandpa," she asked, "did it make a difference?" Elijah folded the newspaper in his lap, untouched for the last hour, and looked at her. He thought about all the letters he had received. The young black boy from Chicago who wrote, "I sat in the front row at my new school because of you." The Latina flight attendant from Dallas who messaged, "The Monroe Code gave me a voice I didn't think I had." The elderly white veteran from Ohio who emailed, "I realized silence was never neutral. Thank you." And he smiled, soft, steady, proud. "It made a difference to the ones who needed it too," he said. And that was enough. In a small office near downtown, Sierra Maddox hung a frame quote on her wall. Not from a president, not from a billionaire, from Elijah Monroe. "You can't control how they see you, You can only control how you see yourself. She smiled every time she looked at it, because she knew words like those didn't just trend. They lived, they taught, they built something stronger than outrage. Legacy. One evening, Elijah attended a quiet dedication ceremony at SkyWest Atlantic's Boston terminal. No flashing cameras, no grand speeches, just a small plaque near Gate 17A where it had all begun. It read, "In honor of Elijah Monroe, whose quiet dignity helped rewrite the rules of respect in the skies." The Monroe Code 2025. Elijah stood there for a long time, hands tucked in his pockets, reading the simple words again and again, not out of vanity, but out of reverence, because it wasn't about him. It was about everyone who would board a plane tomorrow, or walk into a boardroom or a classroom or a courtroom, and not be questioned for existing there. At least, not as easily, not without consequence. As the sun dipped below the Boston skyline, Elijah turned and walked away from the plaque without ceremony. No need for lingering. No need for applause. The work wasn't over, but it had begun, and that was enough for now. Back home in Baton Rouge, Elijah returned to his routine. Sunday mornings with coffee and jazz records. Afternoons tinkering in the garage. Evenings spent helping Ava with her homework. But every so often he'd receive a letter. A note slipped into his mailbox. A message on his doorstep. A handwritten thank you from someone he would never meet. And each one reminded him, sometimes staying still is the strongest stand you can take. On one such evening, Ava climbed into his lap again, just like she had after that first night's storm. "Tell me again," she said. "Tell you what?" "How you changed everything without saying a word." Elijah chuckled, low and warm. "I said some words, baby, just not the ones they expected." Ava scrunched her nose thoughtfully. "Yeah, you said the important ones." He kissed the crown of her head. "That's the trick," he whispered. "Save your voice for the things that matter. Let your presence do the rest." And so it was. A black man in first class rewrote the rules of who gets to belong, of who gets to sit, of who gets to be seen, without needing to apologize for taking up space. Not with rage, not with fury, but with unshakable, unstoppable, undeniable dignity. And somewhere, deep in the silent places of the world, 1,000 small revolutions stirred in response. Because once dignity is seen, once it's recognized, once it's honored, it never disappears. It just grows, quietly, powerfully, like Elijah Monroe himself. If this story moved you, imagine the difference we can make together. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories that inspire change, spark hope, and remind us all of the power of dignity. Your support helps these voices be heard. Stay with us. More journeys are coming.